The chamber was hushed, the air heavy with the weight of diplomatic ritual. Delegates shifted in their seats, pens poised over notepads, expecting yet another routine volley of prepared statements. And then, with a voice that cut like a blade through the stillness, Pakistan's envoy thundered, "Israel fakes victimhood while committing state terrorism." The words did not merely echo, they detonated. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Heads snapped upward, eyes widened. Translation earpieces crackled with hurried whispers as diplomats strained to confirm they had heard correctly. Across the hall, some jaws tightened in outrage, others fell open in stunned recognition. The charged silence felt like the pause before a storm, but in that instant, the Grand Hall of the United Nations transformed into a global stage. Cameras zoomed, microphones hummed, and the world leaned in. Outside the chamber, phones lit up with alerts. Social media feeds exploded with fragments of the quote. Hashtags birthing in real time. Hashtag truth at unhashtag state terrorism exposed. The line became a spark racing across the digital landscape, igniting debates, solidarity, fury, and hope all at once. For decades, Israel had positioned itself as the eternal victim, cloaked in sympathy, shielded from scrutiny. And here was Pakistan, breaking the spell, hurling truth like a torch into the darkness. The audacity electrified the moment. Some diplomats nodded subtly, as if silently affirming what they had long thought but never dared to say. Others bristled, their faces stiffening with discomfort, as though the very architecture of their alliances had been jolted. The air itself felt different now, charged with tension, alive with consequence. Journalists rushed to file breaking headlines. Analysts whispered that something irreversible had just occurred. The world was no longer watching a debate. It was watching history being written in real time, one searing sentence at a time. But the envoy did not pause for applause nor recoil from the shock he had unleashed. He pressed forward, his words carrying the conviction of a nation forged from struggle, the weight of millions who had felt the sting of injustice. He spoke not just for Pakistan, but for every silenced voice straining to be heard. And yet, as powerful as this first strike was, it was merely the opening salvo. The chamber had been shaken. Yes, Israel's image had been pierced, undeniably. But what came next would do more than shake the room. It would tear through Israel's carefully crafted narrative, leaving the world to grapple with truths too long buried. The chamber still trembled with the weight of Pakistan's words, but beneath the silence, a deeper realization began to take shape. This was no ordinary exchange of diplomatic barbs. The floor of the United Nations had become something else entirely, a symbolic battlefield, where truth itself was being tested against the machinery of propaganda. The stakes stretched far beyond the speeches or the applause of delegates. What hung in the balance was nothing less than the credibility of the international order. For decades, Palestinians had carried their grief to this hall, only to see it diluted into resolutions buried in dusty archives. Each time, the global community had claimed to listen, yet justice slipped further away. Today felt different. Pakistan's words pierced through that history like a flare in the night sky, demanding that the world either confront reality or continue its descent into hypocrisy. Was the UN truly a guardian of peace, or had it become a theater where power masqueraded as morality? Two progressives around the world, the moment felt visceral. Two immigrants who had carried their stories of exile and displacement into new lands. It was not just a speech, it was a mirror. They saw in Palestine's struggle the echoes of their own battles for dignity, for belonging, for survival in systems designed to erase them. In Pakistan's defiance, they heard their own voices amplified. At last, on the world's grandest stage, and for ordinary people, far from the marble floors of New York, the stakes were no less personal. A shopkeeper in Karachi, a student in Johannesburg, a nurse in Detroit each scrolled through their phones, watching clips of the confrontation, and felt something stir inside them. They recognized the drama for what it was, a collision between arrogance and truth, between a narrative long protected and a reality long denied. The moral compass of the world was being tested in real time. Would the chamber turn its gaze once again, blinded by alliances and economic deals? Or would this moment carve open a space where justice could no longer be ignored? The tension was not simply diplomatic. It was moral, emotional, human. It was a reminder that history does not wait for comfortable consensus. It is written in fire, in defiance, in voices that refuse to be silenced. Pakistan's intervention had lit that fire. Yet one line, however powerful, was not enough to topple decades of carefully polished storytelling. Israel's narrative of victimhood had been cultivated, protected, and repeated so often that it had become an article of faith for much of the world. To truly grasp why Pakistan's words mattered so profoundly, one had to peel back the layers of that story to see how a tragedy had been weaponized, how sympathy had been converted into shield. The chamber was restless now. Delegates leaned forward, some eager, some anxious, all aware that what came next could fracture the carefully managed silence that had protected Israel for so long. This was not merely about speeches. It was about whether truth could break through a wall of myths fortified by power. And so, the stage was set. Pakistan had drawn the battle lines. Justice against propaganda, memory against manipulation. The world was watching, waiting, holding its breath. But to truly understand the weight of this blow, we must first look at Israel's long-standing narrative of victory. Israel's story has long been told as one of survival against impossible odds. Born from the ashes of one of humanity's darkest atrocities, it fashioned itself into the eternal underdog, a nation clawing for existence in a hostile region, forever vulnerable, forever misunderstood. This narrative of victimhood has not only shaped Israel's identity, but has been its greatest weapon, a shield that deflected scrutiny even as its power grew. In countless speeches, press releases, and media campaigns, Israel has projected itself as David standing before Goliath. Every rocket fired from Gaza, every protest at a checkpoint, every cry from a refugee camp was reframed through that lens. Proof, it claimed, that Israel was the one under siege. The world was urged to see it not as the occupier with one of the region's strongest militaries, but as the perpetual victim surrounded by existential threats. And for years, much of the world obliged. The memory of the Holocaust loomed so large that any criticism risked being branded as betrayal, or worse, anti-Semitism. Sympathy became silence. Silence became complicity. Governments repeated the mantra of Israel's insecurity while turning away from the Palestinians penned into blockades. Stripped of land, stripped of dignity. But beneath the polished image, contradictions festered. How could a state armed with nuclear capabilities, advanced defense systems, and unwavering Western backing continue to plead vulnerability while imposing military occupation on millions? How could the walls, checkpoints, and airstrikes be reconciled with the language of self-defense? The more Israel claimed weakness, the more it exercised unrestrained strength, and the world, by and large, pretended not to notice. That is what made Pakistan's words so devastating. By calling out false victimhood, the envoy did more than challenge a foreign policy stance. He struck at the heart of Israel's carefully curated mythology, the mythology that allowed bombs to fall on Gaza while news anchors repeated that Israel was defending itself, the mythology that turned settlers' expansion into security measures, the mythology that painted protests as terrorism and erased the humanity of those demanding freedom. It was arrogance, in many ways, that kept this narrative alive for so long. Arrogance in assuming that history's sympathy was infinite. Arrogance in dismissing critics as ignorant or prejudiced. Arrogance in believing that the oppressed would remain voiceless forever. The posture of victimhood had become a mask Israel wore so tightly that it no longer noticed when the cracks began to show. And now, in the most public of forums, the cracks were laid bare. Pakistan's challenge was not isolated. It was the culmination of years of growing global unease. Activists in the streets of London, students on campuses in New York, ordinary citizens across Africa and Asia all had begun to question the narrative. The once unshakable shield of victimhood was now seen for what it was, a strategy, not a truth. The chamber felt this shift in the air. For some, it was a threat. How dare anyone challenge what had been untouchable? For others, it was liberation, as though an unspoken truth had finally been said aloud. History teaches that every empire, every power built on myths, eventually faces the reckoning of its contradictions. That reckoning was now knocking at Israel's door. But arrogance rarely yields quietly. The louder the truth grew, the more defensive Israel became. Every criticism was branded as bias, every question painted as hostility. Yet, as the envoy from Pakistan made clear, the mask was slipping. The world could no longer afford to indulge the pretense. Because for every carefully staged press conference, there was a child in Gaza, counting the seconds between bomb blasts. For every statement of insecurity, there was a family in the West Bank watching settlers march across their fields. The contrast was too stark to ignore. And so, the antagonist of this drama was not Israel's people, but the posture of its government, the arrogance of cloaking state violence in the garb of victimhood. That posture had shielded it for decades. But now, confronted by a voice unwilling to bow, it faced a new kind of resistance. Arrogance invites resistance, and it was Pakistan, a nation forged from struggle, that would rise to confront it. Pakistan's story is inseparable from the idea of struggle. Born in 1947 out of a violent partition, the nation emerged, scarred yet determined, forged in the fires of displacement and resilience. Millions crossed borders with little more than their faith in a promise that justice, identity, and dignity could be safeguarded in a land of their own. That collective trauma became the marrow of Pakistan's identity, a living reminder that nations, like people, are not given freedom. They seize it through sacrifice. It is from this history that Pakistan's voice at the United Nations draws its strength. Unlike the polished arrogance of power, its cadence carries memory. The memory of families torn apart by lines on a map, of refugees carrying their children on shoulders as they trudged toward uncertain futures, of communities rebuilding with nothing but faith and survival. To a country born of wounds, the pain of others is not abstract. It is deeply familiar. This is why Palestine's plight resonates so strongly in Pakistan's conscience. From the very beginning, Pakistan aligned itself with the dispossessed. refusing to recognize Israel until the Palestinians received justice. It was not merely politics. It was empathy made policy. Each speech at the UN was not just diplomacy, it was the echo of partition's memory, the solidarity of one wounded nation with another. Generations of Pakistani leaders have carried this banner. In the early days, it was statesmen like Liaquat Ali Khan who spoke of solidarity with oppressed peoples. Later, figures such as Zulfikar Ali Bhutto stood at the same UN podium and thundered about the rights of Palestinians with the passion of someone defending his own kin. Bhutto's speeches still reverberate in history, etched with the defiance of a nation unwilling to bow before larger powers. But beyond the grand stage, Pakistan's empathy was lived in its streets, in mosques and marketplaces, in schools and universities. Ordinary Pakistanis carried the Palestinian cause in their hearts. Demonstrations flared not for the sake of politics, but for the recognition of shared humanity. Children painted flags, elders prayed for liberation, families donated whatever they could to show solidarity. This was not foreign policy, it was personal. It is also generational. Young Pakistanis, growing up in a digital age, see the images from Gaza and the West Bank on their phones, unfiltered, unmediated. They see children not unlike themselves, ducking under rubble, parents crying over shattered homes. These images resonate in ways that statistics never could. And when Pakistan's envoy rises at the UN, they see their nation reflecting their outrage, their pain, their defiance. It is validation that their voices, too, matter. The country's global role, though often constrained by its own internal struggles, has always found moral clarity on Palestine. While its politics have shifted, its leaders overthrown, its institutions tested, the thread of solidarity has remained unbroken. The nation that knows what it means to be uprooted, that has buried its own martyrs in wars and displacement, cannot ignore the cries of those who live that trauma every day. And this is why, when Pakistan's envoy stood before the assembly, his words carried more than diplomatic weight. They carried the soul of a people who have known injustice firsthand. His speech was not only about foreign policy, it was a voice carved from history, amplified by sacrifice, sharpened by empathy. Unlike Israel's posture of arrogance, Pakistan's tone was not born of superiority but of memory. It was the memory of mothers who lost sons in partition, of refugees who rebuilt their lives from ashes, of soldiers who died believing their struggle was not in vain. That collective memory gave Pakistan a moral authority that statistics and alliances could never grant. The chamber could feel it. This was not a sterile statement from a dispassionate bureaucrat. It was something older, deeper, a reminder that nations created from struggle often carry within them a fire that cannot be dimmed. And in this moment, that fire blazed across the hall, lighting up truths that had long been buried beneath diplomacy's polite evasions. The envoy's voice did not rise in anger for its own sake. It rose as if pulled upward by history itself, as if the ghosts of partition and the cries of Palestinian children converged into one chorus. Every syllable carried the weight of a nation that has suffered, endured, and stood firm in solidarity with others who share that fate. And that is what made this confrontation inevitable. Israel's arrogance had survived for so long because many chose silence. But Pakistan, a nation birthed from injustice, could not remain silent. It had always been preparing for this stage, this moment, this clash. And so, when Pakistan's envoy rose to speak, it was not just policy. It was history, blood, and dignity speaking through them. The chamber, once quiet in the afterglow of Pakistan's searing indictment, began to vibrate with tension. The air was charged, as though history itself had entered the room and refused to leave. Israel's delegation, faces taut with controlled fury, pressed their microphones. They would not let this stand. The Israeli envoy's voice cut sharp across the hall, each word calculated, each phrase designed to reclaim the narrative. He spoke of ancient wounds, of Jewish survival against impossible odds, of Israel's right to exist amid hostile neighbors. He wrapped himself in the mantle of perpetual victimhood, casting his nation as David surrounded by many goals. And for a moment, some in the hall nodded, compelled by the emotional force of survival's story. But something was different this time. Pakistan's envoy did not flinch. He leaned forward, steady eyes locked, as though he had rehearsed this confrontation in his bones for generations. He let Israel's words flow unchecked, absorbing them, holding them in suspension like a boxer biding time before the counterpunch. Then came the escalation. The Pakistani envoy's voice cut back, not with noise, but with clarity. He repeated the charge. Israel fakes victimhood while committing state terrorism, but now layered it with sharp detail. He named the children buried in rubble, the families driven from their homes, the journalists silenced in Gaza's streets. Each example landed like a hammer blow, stripping away the abstraction and forcing the room to see faces, not numbers. The Israeli envoy bristled, interrupting, accusing Pakistan of hypocrisy, of harboring terrorists, of being unfit to lecture anyone on morality. His words were barbed, meant to wound, to discredit. Some in the hall gasped at the bluntness, others shook their heads. Yet Pakistan's envoy did not rise to the insult. Instead, he turned it back, calm but unrelenting. It is the oldest trick of oppressors to point fingers elsewhere, hoping no one notices the blood on their own hands. The chamber stirred. Delegates whispered. A few shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, for in that moment the masks of diplomacy had slipped, and what remained was wrought two nations locked in a battle not only of policy but of legitimacy. The escalation was no longer rhetorical. It had become existential. For Israel, survival of its narrative. For Pakistan, survival of truth itself. And as the exchange grew sharper, as the stakes rose higher, it was clear. One side was rattled, clinging to old scripts, while the other stood anchored, drawing strength not from power but from history. But what came next would not just escalate the tension, it would break it wide open. The room had reached its breaking point. Words had flown like arrows, accusations piled upon accusations. But it was clear, the world was waiting for the counterstrike. The Pakistani envoy rose once more, his presence commanding yet calm, the weight of entire generations pressing behind him. Cameras zoomed in, pens hovered above notepads, and the silence was thick enough to choke on. What he was about to say would not merely respond, it would detonate. He began with a pause. Silence, deliberate and searing. In that stillness, the anticipation grew unbearable. Then, in a voice steady but edged with fire, he unleashed the mic drop moment. Israel claims the role of eternal victim, but the evidence shows the opposite. It is the Palestinians who are under siege, their homes demolished, their lands stolen, their children buried before they can grow. You cannot occupy a people and then weep when they resist. You cannot bomb hospitals and then cry foul when the world calls it terror. The words echoed across the chamber like thunderclaps. The Israeli delegation stiffened, their composure cracking. One diplomat shook his head furiously. Another scribbled notes with trembling hands. The Pakistani envoy pressed forward, his cadence deliberate, each word carved with precision. This is not about history textbooks or religious symbolism. This is about today, this very hour. As we sit in this hall, drones circle Gaza. Families sit in darkness, without power, without medicine, without hope. And yet Israel dares to posture as the wronged party. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Delegates shifted in their seats. Some lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet the force of his gaze. Others sat transfixed, drinking in the courage of a man who dared to puncture one of the most fortified narratives in modern politics. Then came the proof. Screens lit up with images smoldering rubble where homes once stood. Schoolbooks scattered in dust. Children with wide, terrified eyes staring into cameras. Look at them, he said, his voice cracking not with weakness but with righteous fury. These are not terrorists. These are children who will never see adulthood. These are families who will never break bread together again. This is the cost of Israel's so-called security. This is state terrorism, dressed up as defense. The room shuddered. The Israeli envoy pressed his microphone, protesting, but his words were drowned out by the murmurs swelling across the chamber. Pakistan's envoy seized the moment. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm cut sharper than any shout. We are told Israel's actions are survival. But what kind of survival requires crushing another people into dust? What kind of survival requires a wall taller than any prison fence? What kind of survival requires erasing another nation's children, one generation at a time? A heavy silence followed. Even allies of Israel sat uneasy, their eyes darting between their notes and the floor, unwilling to lock gazes with the truth laid bare. And then, the final strike, the words that would echo beyond this hall, into homes, streets, and screens across the globe. Israel has mastered the art of false victory, but the mask has slipped. Today, the world sees not a besieged nation, but an occupying power. Today, the narrative is broken, and no amount of spin can erase what the world has witnessed with its own eyes. The chamber erupted not in applause. For the UN is not built for clapping but in noise. Murmurs, whispers, the frantic tapping of devices as journalists sent headlines racing across the globe. Social media lit up instantly. Hashtags surged. Clips spread like wildfire. Commentators calling it the speech that shattered Israel's shield. Israel's envoy sat rigid, stone-faced, lips pressed into a tight line, the weight of centuries of narratives suddenly teetering on collapse. Pakistan's envoy, in contrast, simply leaned back, his mission complete. He had not shouted, he had not pleaded, he had revealed on revelation, once unleashed, cannot be contained. And yet, this was not the end. For the words, the images, the raw truth unleashed in that chamber would not remain confined to those walls. They were already spilling out, shaping conversations across continents, igniting debates in living rooms, emboldening voices that had long been silenced. But as the shockwaves began to spread, one question lingered above them all. How would the world react now that the mask of false victimhood had been torn away? The explosion inside the UN chamber did not end when the microphones clicked off. In fact, it had only just begun. Within minutes, clips of Pakistan's envoy's thunderous words were circulating across every corner of social media. The speech was spliced, subtitled, shared, and reshared on TikTok, on X, On Instagram Reels, each replay carrying the same electric jolt. A nation standing up to one of the most protected narratives in modern politics. Hashtags surged with a force that felt almost choreographed by destiny itself. Hashtags, hashtag false victim, hashtag stand with, but the one that captured hearts and spread fastest was simple. Hashtag truth at millions of posts erupted under that banner, as users from Karachi to California declared that they had just witnessed history. Commentators piled in. Prominent journalists called it the boldest takedown of Israel at the UN in decades. Influencers with millions of followers shared snippets with captions like, "Finally, someone said it out loud." Even celebrities, long wary of stepping into this volatile debate, retweeted clips with fiery emojis or a single, searing word, truth. Meanwhile, pro-Israel voices scrambled to respond. Lobby groups released hurried statements, claiming the envoy's words were slander, propaganda, hate. Israeli officials went on Western news outlets to regain control of the story, framing Pakistan's stance as reckless and dangerous. But for once, the counter-message sounded desperate, defensive, almost hollow. Because the people were not listening to official press releases. They were listening to the raw video of one man standing at the UN microphone, daring to name what others danced around. And that rawness carried a moral force institutions could not contain. In the streets of Gaza and Ramallah, small crowds gathered around television sets, watching the replay with tears in their eyes. Children pointed at the screen, asking their parents to explain who this man was, why he was saying words they had longed to hear spoken in the halls of power. In refugee camps, where despair often feels permanent, for one night there was a flicker of validation. Somewhere was speaking their pain into existence. In Western cities, immigrant families felt the speech cut deep into their own memories of struggle. Mothers whispered to daughters. Fathers nodded in quiet recognition. This was not just about Palestine. It was about every people who had ever been told their suffering didn't count. For progressives, for students, for activists long dismissed as fringe for raising these points, the UN microphone had become their microphone. Their truth had been spoken on the world's grandest stage. And yet, beneath the euphoria, there was tension. Politicians in Washington, London, and Paris faced mounting pressure. Would they condemn Pakistan's words? Would they distance themselves from Israel's unraveling defense? Or would they double down on old alliances, risking the perception that they were siding with power against justice? Editorials began to emerge in major newspapers. Some tried to soften the blow, framing the envoy's remarks as inflammatory but worth examining. Others admitted outright. The narrative of perpetual Israeli victimhood had been shaken. One headline read, "Pakistan just said what millions already believe." The ripple effect reached beyond politics. In universities, debates reignited. In activist circles, new energy surged. Even in corporate boardrooms, where silence often reigns supreme, whispers arose about the risks of ignoring a public increasingly unwilling to swallow one-sided stories. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from ordinary people who had long felt powerless. A tweet from a young woman in New York captured the mood perfectly. "I've been gaslit my whole life about this. Tonight, I feel seen." The aftermath was not just a media storm. It was a crack in the facade of inevitability. Israel's carefully curated narrative, polished for decades, had been challenged in a way that resonated far beyond the diplomats in that chamber. The battle was no longer confined to speeches or statements. It was in the feeds, the conversations, the shifting tide of public opinion. And yet, as the world reeled from the shockwaves, one looming question remained unanswered. What lesson would humanity draw from this confrontation? Would it lead to deeper division, or would it awaken a higher call for justice and dignity? The answer lay in what came next, when the moral meaning of the moment would be distilled, sharpened, and delivered not as an attack, but as a universal truth. Out of the chaos of debate and the roar of reactions, something quieter began to emerge. It wasn't the noise of hashtags or the fury of official statements. It was the deeper question behind it all. What does this moment mean for humanity? The Pakistani envoy's words had not simply indicted a state. They had exposed a moral fracture at the heart of our global order. And in that fracture lay a lesson, one that reached beyond Israel and Palestine, beyond borders, beyond politics. It was about the eternal struggle between dignity and domination, between truth and the theater of lies. False victimhood, he had said, and the phrase stuck because it spoke to something universal. How many times in history had power worn the mask of pain to justify inflicting pain on others? How many times had empires claimed to be defending themselves while grinding weaker nations into the dust? The speech ripped away that mask and reminded the world, survival is not license for oppression. For progressives, for immigrants, for the marginalized, the lesson rang like a bell. Dignity is not granted by the powerful, it is claimed by those who refuse to be silenced. The Envoys.com defiance was not just about Palestine. It was about every people told to sit quietly while their suffering was dismissed. His words became a mirror in which millions saw their own struggle reflected. and in that reflection came inspiration. Viewers saw that even in the coldest, most calculated arena of international politics, truth could still shine. Even in a hall where power often speaks louder than morality, a single voice could tilt the balance. This was not only a political confrontation, it was a reminder of human possibility. The resolution then was not to demonize one nation forever, nor to canonize another. It was to recognize the universal principle at stake. No people's trauma can justify another people's dispossession. No state's history of suffering can become a license to perpetuate suffering on others. Justice is indivisible. And so, as the echoes of the speech lingered across the globe, a moral current began to flow. That courage matters. That speaking truth matters. That silence in the face of oppression is itself complicity. Pakistan's envoy had not merely defended Palestine, he had defended the very idea that truth can stand against propaganda, that dignity can stand against power, that humanity can stand against cruelty. The speech was over, but the lesson was not. It had seeped into the bloodstream of the global conversation, challenging citizens everywhere to choose, stand with justice, or stand with silence. And as those choices began to ripple outward, it became clear this confrontation at the UN was not an ending, but a beginning. And so, as the lights dimmed on that UN session, the world was left with a truth too powerful to ignore. For one brief, unforgettable moment, the balance of narratives had shifted, the masks of diplomacy had fallen, and the raw face of justice had stared the world in the eye. Pakistan's envoy had not spoken for applause, nor for political points. He had spoken for those without a microphone, for the families under rubble, for the children whose laughter had been stolen, for every silenced voice yearning to be heard. His words became more than a statement. They became a call, echoing far beyond the marble walls of New York. And now that call reaches you. What side of history will you stand on? Will you allow propaganda to define your conscience, or will you claim your right to see and speak truth? Will you remain silent as injustice parades as survival? Or will you raise your voice for dignity, for justice, for humanity itself? Because this is not just about nations, or politics, or diplomacy. It is about us, our values, our courage, our willingness to stand where it is hardest to stand. The world is watching, but more importantly, history is recording. If this moment moved you, do not let it pass. Share it, speak it, carry it. Join the millions who refuse to be silent, who believe that justice is worth the fight, and that dignity is not negotiable. Subscribe, stay with us, and become part of a movement that insists on truth in the face of power. The speech has ended, but the story is only beginning, and you are part of its next chapter.